My full name is Kyung-Sin Park, but my acronym KS got stuck when I went to law school in the US, so you can call me KS. So I'll talk about data governance, but not in pure form. If I were to talk about data governance, the most important topic will be data protection law. I will talk about that a little bit, but when I was first approached for this topic, or when I first volunteered for this topic, I meant to talk about governance of data with respect to the fact that the data is networked. So I'll focus on that, and that will be the main theme. But because the data is networked, it caused the legal community to create new norms, which is data protection law, and I'm going to talk about that as well. So this is the roadmap. What is governance of network data? I'm not talking about just the data that resides in your hard disk, data that resides in your notebook. I'm not talking about data that resides in a loan database. I'm talking about data that resides in a networked environment. And how governance of the data changes because of the fact that it resides on network. That fact pushed the legal community to come up with the new laws that respond to the fact that the data is networked. Liability of platforms and liabilities of intermediary. That's one area. The second area is liability for hyperlinking to data. Okay. So for instance, behind a certain hyperlink, suppose that behind a certain hyperlink, illegal data resides. For instance, data violating copyright law. Is providing a hyperlink also illegal? Search engine also is another way to facilitate data transfer or access to data that can be illegal. What should be the norm controlling those players facilitating access to the data? Also, the fact that the data is networked requires to look at the global scale within which the data we need is to be pursued by law enforcement, etc. So we will talk about this. So that's the roadmap for next 50 minutes. Before we go on there, just want you to, I'm not going to go into all these vocabularies, but I just want you to kind of retrieve from your memory what all these terms are. So intermediary. You know what's meant by intermediary. You know that the internet is composed of all these intermediaries that are voluntarily networked each other, which includes content providers, application providers, platform providers, and also internet access providers, domain name servers. And I'll also use the term ISP, that's Internet Service Provider. They're the ones providing physical access to the internet. Also, TCP/IP is the protocol by which all the computers constituting the internet have come to connect it with one another. Among those computers that are networked with one another, a router computer plays a singularly important role because it is the router computers operating the routing tables that decide how the data travel from one place to another over a global scale. Domain name servers are also, they also play singularly important roles because they provide you, they convert your domain name request with the correct IP addresses, which means they bring you the contents of the exact computers that you would like to get data from. So again, governance of network data. On internet, where is data? Data resides in network. It's not stationary in one place. When you visit a website, you don't actually go to any place. You just sit there in front of your computer and you receive a copy of the content that resides in the computer serving that content. That computer can be in your neighborhood. That computer can be physically in another country, on another continent. What you get is an exact copy of the HTML that resides on another computer controlled by someone else. So in the early days of internet governance, there was a talk about is viewing a web page also copyright infringement? Because when you somehow figure out a URL of a certain web page and you type that in, and you get an exact copy of that web page, and there's really no intermediate process of getting permission. So in early days, there were court cases that were ruling even visiting a web page as copyright infringement. Because you get a copy without, you get a copy of that and have it show on your computer without permission. Now later, the courts decided that this doesn't make sense. The fact that the server operator created some content and converted to HTML and put the content on a computer connected to the TCP/IP means the operator implicitly consented to all other people getting a copy of that web page without permission. That's how it worked out. I'm talking about that history only because it highlights how the data in the internet age is not consumed on standalone devices, but resides in the network. There is really no place where the data resides. It resides everywhere on the network. It can potentially reside on every point on network, because if 1 million people watch YouTube video, there will be 1 million copies that are distributed over the globe. 1 million copies of that video. So how does this aspect of internet change the rules of data governance? Well, the rise of platforms and intermediaries that facilitate this data access to the data residing on the network created this new norm, intermediary liability. what the content of intermediate liability will be discussed later. But what's important is these intermediaries are facilitating people's access to various data that resides on the network, and some of the data may be illegal or maybe tools of crime or the products of crime. What should be the norm controlling the platforms and intermediaries facilitating that access? And importance of navigation. Now, data itself is important, but what's more important is where it resides, because now data is everywhere, but to access the data, you need the intermediaries that facilitate that access. So hyperlinking, search, these are functions. So search operators and the web page host that contain the hyperlink to whatever that unlawful data, that also has become important, and that resulted in the norms about hyperlinking liability and search liability. And also the fact that the data resides in network created this phenomenon that once something is uploaded, it exists permanently online, because it can be shared by multitude of people, and it's nearly impossible to track down each shared content. So the data now, once going online, exists permanently, and that pushed people into thinking about how to bring it down if there is some just cause for bringing it down. For instance, let's say I put up my nude picture taken when I was 11 years old. I don't want you to imagine it. But let's say I made a mistake of putting that online and it's being shared virally. Should I be given a chance to bringing it down? And what happens when the data is so widely available that going after the host of each copy of the content is impossible? That gave rise to this norm of right to be forgotten. Hence the famous case, Google Spain. Also, the fact that the data resides everywhere on the internet has forced the idea or forced the question of which country or which sovereign, which government should have the power to force the intermediary, the host, to turn the data over for law enforcement. This is the famous case of Microsoft Ireland. So law enforcement, I think it's IRS, Internal Revenue, the tax authority of the US, were investigating a US businessman, and they wanted to have access to his data, his financial data that resides on Microsoft Cloud Service. And Microsoft happened to put the cloud server in Ireland. And when the data access request, it was a warrant. It was a warrant lawfully issued by a US court, again issued against Microsoft. When the warrant was presented to Microsoft, Microsoft said, the data is no longer within the US, it is in Ireland. You, the Department of Justice, or you, IRS, will have to go to Ireland and to get a warrant from a court or a court of the government that has jurisdiction over the location of the cloud server, which was Ireland. Also, the issue of who has the jurisdiction for obtaining data came up. And the other side of the coin is who has the jurisdiction to block data. So the case of CNIL, case of APSIG. Case of CNIL is about right to be forgotten. Case of APSIG is about trademark law. There were some data that's considered unlawful, either under right to be forgotten law or under trademark law. And the relevant authorities sued Google to stop indexing, stop providing search results that lead to that unlawful data, either forgettable data or trademark violating data. And the issue is, the debate is hot right now, whether Google has a duty to take out the search results only from the countries within which right to be forgotten law applies, or the relevant trademark law applies, or have to take out from search results in the global domain. Okay, not just from google.eu, not just from google.cn, which is Canada. No, google.ca. CA is Canada, right? Yeah. But google.com. That's the debate right now. And also, because data resides on network, whenever you use some online service, you are not just using the device and data that resides in your vicinity. You are pulling in network resources all over the globe. I mean, you say cloud, but internet is very much the cloud. So when you are visiting any website, you are pulling content from computer that resides 1,000 miles away. And that necessitated transfer of data across borders, across national borders. And the question is, what considerations apply when data changes location from one country to another? Data subject, I'm going to talk about data protection law later, but let's remind ourselves the concept of data subject, right? If, that K.S. Park is a professor, that's a data. What is data subject of that data? Who's the data subject of that data? The data that K.S. Park is a professor. K.S. Park is the data subject. And data subjects are considered to have some control over how that data is circulated. And I, as a data subject, may have a concern if data flows from a country where data protection is strong to a country where data protection law is weak. What right do I have when data changes the location from when data cross the border? And this will have potentially paralyzing effect on the operation of the internet, because for the internet to work properly, data transfer across borders should happen seamlessly ad infinitum. because that's how the data is being shared over the internet. If every cross-border data transfer needs be permitted, needs to be approved by the data subject, it will mean the end of the internet as we know it. So intermediate reliability is the first, I would say, data governance rule that came into being because of the fact that data is networked. And we all know about the social significance of the internet. It gives powerless individuals ability to speak not just to his or her friends, but to the whole world. In the past, for you to speak to the whole world, you had to be on the good side of newspaper reporters or TV producers and let them deliver the news to the TV or newspaper. But now anybody can purchase an IP address, purchase a domain name, set up a server on your computer, and have it available for the whole world to look at. At the same time, it doesn't force the whole world to read your message. That's what's good about the internet. It gives everyone freedom to speak to the whole world, but also it gives freedom to the whole world. It gives freedom to each and every person, freedom to choose what to listen to and what to view. So this aspect of the internet has been interpreted to be facilitating social changes, including Jasmine Revolution in 2010 and 2011. And also another reason that people became increasingly skeptical of TV, the legacy media, the TV and newspaper, is that in many developing countries, television tends to be under the influence of the government, and newspapers tend to come under the influence of their advertisers, the capital, the businesses. Korean Constitutional Court ruled in 2012 on the famous case striking down the Internet Real Name Law, stated the Internet is a rare medium through which humanity can overcome offline hierarchy of gender, age, social status, and speak equally to one another, and thereby achieve democracy. Then the singularly important question is how to preserve that freedom given to each individual connected to the internet, freedom to upload and download unapproved, without approval of the intermediaries, without approval of some important people like reporters or TV producers. The answer to that question was intermediary liability safe harbor. Platforms shall not be liable for the contents that they are not aware of. The idea was that if platforms are held liable for content that come up on their platform, come up on their servers, then in fear of being held liable, they'll pre-approve every content that gets uploaded. So to prevent intermediaries from falling into that self-censorship, many countries, EU, US, Japan, And in some sense, Korea, also India, passed these laws that protected the legal liability of the platforms. And Manila Principles is one effort by global civil society to expand and improve upon the current intermediary liability regimes. Then how about known contents? Well, and if you look at Manila Principles, they wanted to even strengthen the safe harbor by replacing notice and takedown with a notice to notice. So notice and takedown literally means platforms will protect themselves from liability if they take down the contents that they noticed or the contents that they are given notice of. And notice to notice says platforms will protect them, shield themselves from liability as long as they give notice. They pass on the notice to the content host when they receive notification of illegality. So it's a much more robust intermediary liability regime, robust safe harbor regime. How about the contents that are pointed out by someone, but illegality is not clear? On that, Korea has a mandatory notice and takedown regime, which OpenNet has fought against or has tried to improve upon for several years, or that can flow into general tort liability. So general tort liability applies. So under general tort liability, according to how much you are aware of the illegality of the content, you can be held liable as an intermediary. And then there is this third approach that came out of India in the case of Sharia single. Yes, and there the court has gone even further and said, okay, well, to shield yourself from liability, the only thing you need to do is take down the contents that are pointed out as illegal by courts only. You don't need to take down contents called upon as illegal by private individuals. You can just respond to take down notices coming from the courts. That's it, which is, I think, is the most progressive intermediary liability regime that the world has seen. Then, the history progresses in a helical, the history progresses in a helix, as the German philosopher Hegel said. Then we see this very backward intermediary liability law that came out of Germany just 2 weeks ago that hold platforms liable for not taking down, quote, fake news, unquote. So these are the issues surrounding the liability, surrounding the rules concerning liability of the intermediaries facilitating people's access to the data that resides on the network. And I've shown my bias on these issues. We can discuss what you think about it. I would love to hear what you think about the new German fake news law. Navigation tools. Probably this is the most philosophical aspect of data being networked. Data is everywhere already and is summoned by the users, is pointing to the location of the data. Same thing as providing the data, right? when the author of the data is not actively providing it. I mean, you get a copy of HTML only when you call, only when you call upon it. The web host is not really actively pushing the data over to you. It's the computer that's just responding to a URL request from your computer. So is a link to illegal material also illegal? Same thing with a search. I mean, now Google has made search engine so efficient that there is really not that much difference between knowing URL to certain content and just knowing the keywords. Just knowing the search words. Because you put search word on the address bar. I mean, there is not much difference between putting the search word on the address bar and do the search, or knowing the exact URL of the content that you're looking for and put that URL on the address bar. So when the navigation tools have become so efficient, how much liability should these navigation tools carry? And right now, the general trend is that for linking there is not much liability, but for some reason providing search results have been considered more unlawful than providing hyperlink to unlawful data. You can think about this. Okay, and right to be forgotten is also one area of a law that responds to the network nature of data and how data, once uploaded, resides forever. And here I have to go into basics of data protection law a little bit. Now, what is data protection law? Data protection law is a humanities one response, one very, how should I say this, unique response to people's concern about privacy. Now, originally, when you say your privacy is violated, you are talking about some confidential information about you are being forced to be shared with others. For instance, you usually keep confidential your sexual orientation. Let's say a friend of yours somehow finds out and just shares that with a whole community around you. That will be considered a violation of privacy. So it concerned only the data that was held confidential. But people began to be concerned more and more about the accumulation of personal data about people. And they thought that all data should be somehow on all data, not just confidential data, but on all data, people should have some protection. And they came up with data protection law, where data subjects are almost given something like ownership over data about you, as if they own cars, right? So let's say you own a car, right? And your friend borrows a car from you to go shopping, right? And to borrow the car, the friend will need your permission, right? And after the friend borrows the car, let's say the friend wants to use it for some other purpose than shopping. Will the friend need to get permission from me, a new permission from me? Probably, yeah. right? And also, what if I, as the car owner, want to check whether the car is okay? Will I have a right to inspect the car? Yes, right? If I think that the car is somehow broken, do I have a right to fix it, even within the possession of my friend that leased the car from me, right? So those rights that you will have, those controls that you will have on your car are also reflected in the data protection law and are afforded in the same way over the data about yourself. And that will have a tremendous consequences for the internet, because why do we have the internet? Well, we have the internet to facilitate data transfer, and much of it is personal data. And if you give data subjects the right to control how the data is transferred, then each and every time a web page is accessed, I told you that access of web page means traveling of data from host computer to the viewing computer. Every time that happens, will need be approved by a data subject. Of course, data protection law was not actually applied to that crazy level, but it did reach certain intermediate step, and that intermediate step turned out to be Google versus Spain. Now, it doesn't apply to all data, but it applies only to data that's no longer relevant. In this case, data that this Spanish lawyer was subject to forced judicial sale of forced auction of his house for not paying his tax. And the court decided that that data is no longer relevant, and that data, the availability of that data can be suppressed by manipulating search results, or should be suppressed by manipulating or censoring the search results. And also, it's not about all data that's no longer relevant, but only the data accessed to the search results. And not all search results, but only those searches based on the petitioner's name. So the search results about, not all search results, but only the search results that come up when the data subject's name is entered into the search window. But still, this case, Google versus Spain, causes us to think a lot about data governance, because there's so much data about us on the internet, and even the data seemingly not about us can be considered data about us, and how much we will give ourselves power to take down all that data has tremendous consequences on how free the internet can be run. So you can, I'm providing all these links for you to look at later. So one debate is whether data protection law should apply to publicly available data. For instance, the fact that you partially paid off your tax liability by having your house auctioned off, and that auction has to be public auction. It's the same in every country. So that publicly available data, how much should that be suppressed just because you feel shameful about the fact that you had your house auctioned off. Just because you want to forget about the past of financial difficulty, does that entitle you to blind all your peers and everybody on the internet from having access? Does it entitle to blind everyone else from the fact that you had your house auctioned off? How much control should we really give ourselves on the data that we voluntarily placed on the network? Not as a child, but as an adult. How about you go commit a crime that necessitates publicity, that makes people come pay attention? Let's say you commit a murder. Hospital people will come to care for the victims. Police will come. 911 will come. So you cause all the publicity, and then as a data subject, you feel shamed about that incident. You want to be forgotten about that incident. Does that entitle you to force Google or the search engines or other facilitators, other intermediaries, to censor the data that's made available about you? And then the other question is a search even really within the purview of data protection law? Because data protection law is originally about like hospitals, schools, government agencies that receive the data turned over to them when the people want to get some government services. So that data resides in the government's database, and the government consciously uses that data, right? And data protection law is there to protect the people when the government abuses that data. You know, the government gets the data to give you health services, but the government uses it to, for instance, track down on sexual orientation of the people. That will be abuse, right? That was the original application of data protection law. But is search engine really that type of use of data? Because what search engine does is search engine sends out these web crawlers, and it constantly surveys the web and takes down the keywords, and then brings to you the web pages that have those keywords. Of course, I mean, Google the search engine doesn't just send out web crawlers, but the result brought back by the web crawlers are nicely indexed. So there is a kind of database that the search engines build, but does that really change the fact that the search engines just provide the data in a very automatic, impersonal way? They don't actually make use of the data. Will this change if instantaneous crawling is made possible? Then the search engine will not even build index database. Jurisdiction for taking down and jurisdiction for accessing information. I think I have only 5 minutes more, so I'll just be quick on this one. So a child pornography is distributed online, distributed through online social media. Which country should have jurisdiction to take it down? How about locus of data, right? What if the data, locus of the server? So if it's Facebook, it will be California. How about locus of child? How about locus of distributor? How about locus of physical conduit? I'm talking about the telco through which the child pornography travels to be viewed by whoever is accessing the image. Each of these candidate for jurisdiction will not be a satisfying answer to child pornography activist or child pornography regulator. One answer that people are gravitating toward is Google. Forcing Google not just take down data because they cannot, but censor the search results so that people cannot have easy access to that illegal data. And CNIL, the French case, and Acoustic, the Canada case, represent people's desire to use Google as a police, some sort of thought police, so that certain data are not made accessible to us. Now the question is, trademark law changes country to country. Right to be forgotten law changes from country to country. Right now, right to be forgotten law, as represented by Google versus Spain, applies only to Europe, not to users outside Europe. So, assuming that Google has a responsibility to censor the search results or censor search results leading to illegal information, do they have a duty to take down? Do they have to manipulate search results only for the searches initiated by people residing in the countries where the data is illegal, right? Or should the takedown or should they manipulate the search results for all the searches, right? For instance, the data, certain data may be illegal in Canada, but not illegal in Korea. Does Google have responsibility to block search from Koreans when there's nothing illegal about Koreans accessing that data? Or is it okay if they just interfere with the access from Canadians, because Canadians accessing data will be considered illegal? Jurisdictions for accessing the information, I talked about Microsoft Island. Again, what to do when incriminating evidence resides on a cloud server overseas, locus of suspect, locus of data, locus of intermediary. None of these candidates provide satisfying answer to everybody. So right now, there is a trend, I'll say small but not insignificant trend of gravitating toward creating an international agreement about one country's law enforcement accessing data in another countries. Now, this also has consequences for the internet governance because, for instance, in Korea, whenever there's a flashpoint about government surveillance on people, the market share of Gmail just picks up. Because Gmail server resides outside Korea, it's free from unreasonable search and seizure by Korean prosecutors. So people running away from people who want to avoid that unreasonable search and seizure will shift from the domestic email to Gmail. For the same reason, Telegram has gained much popularity in Korea because people are very fearful of Kakao servers being searched by Korean prosecutors. Right now, under the current trend, people will access. Under the current trend, people will access. Under the current trend, the Korean prosecutors will be able to exercise or enforce their warrant upon the Gmail server that resides in California, and vice versa, which poses a great threat to Korean people who wanted to have more private communication by using Gmail or some mail service whose servers reside outside Korea. I'll talk about cross-border data transfer later in question and answer because my time is up. Thank you very much.